Shalom, I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to share with you regarding the current situation with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as well as review the possibility of a regional war in the Middle East involving the United States, Israel, Syria, and Iran. First, let's share with you regarding the peace process. Israel and Palestinian negotiators have had 2 rounds of talks recently in Jordan for the first time in more than a year to determine whether there is hope of reviving the Middle East peace process. The meetings in Amman took place between Israel's representative Yitzhak Molko and the Palestinian representative Saeb Erekat. They were put together by members of the quartet who consist of the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations. The quartet are mediators of the peace process. The purpose of these talks is to determine if there is enough common ground between Israel and the PLO for direct peace talks. During these meetings, the quartet would like Israel and the PLO to present to each other their views for the borders of a future Palestinian state and security arrangements. In their initial meeting, the PLO submitted to Israel their proposal on borders and security. They were given to the Israeli representative in 2 separate documents, representing the first time an Israeli representative ever accepted to receive Palestinian documents concerning the final borders of a future Palestinian state under Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In response, Israel submitted to the PLO a 21-point outline regarding parameters for a final status peace agreement. While Israeli officials refused to provide specifics about Israel's document, the London-based Pan-Arabic daily newspaper said the 21 points included a refusal to withdraw from all the settlements, an Israeli security presence in the Jordan Valley, that a Palestinian state not be allowed to forge alliances with other countries hostile to Israel, and that Israel would have a continued presence of its military at strategic West Bank sites. And finally, the implementation of an agreement would be implemented gradually over a number of years. Because it was an outline, Israel did not submit to the PLO a detailed proposal on borders and security. A 3rd meeting is being planned on January the 26th in Jordan. Speaking to reporters in Ramallah, PLO President Mahmoud Abbas said that the peace process would not be revived unless Israel agreed to freeze building in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and accepted the pre-1967 lines as a basis for a 2-state solution. Mr. Abbas said that if Israel accepts the Palestinian conditions, we will go to direct negotiations. The PLO leading committee will decide on January the 26th on future Israeli-Palestinian relations when the quartet deadline to restart the peace talks expires, Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat told Voice of Palestine Radio. We are in a hunda, or a truce, until January the 26th, and this political ceasefire will end, said senior Palestinian official Nabil Sha'ath. If on the 26th of January Israel does not come up with a freeze of the settlements and talks based on the 67 borders, we will continue our efforts for recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations, said Sha'ath, who is a senior figure in President Mahmoud Abbas's ruling Fatah party. January 26th is the deadline that the quartet gave at the end of September for Israel and the PLO to agree on borders and security for a Palestinian state. The Palestinian Authority is considering a number of options with regards to its push for full membership in the United Nations, but the timing of those steps will be affected by current efforts to restart direct negotiations with Israel, Palestinian envoy to the United Nations Riyad Mansour said recently. Among the steps that the Palestinians are considering, Mansour explained, are reactivating the application for recognition of a Palestinian state in the United Nations Security Council, moving the request for recognition of a Palestinian state to the United United Nations General Assembly, who would vote on it, joining other UN agencies beside UNESCO, which the PLO recently joined, and the option of becoming a state party to various international treaties and conventions. Israel Defense Minister Ehud Barak said that there was little hope for a breakthrough in the peace process after Israeli and Palestinian Authority negotiators met in the past week. Israel Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman dismissed newly rekindled diplomatic contacts with the Palestinians, accusing them of not negotiating in good faith. The Palestinians have no interest in restarting peace talks with Israel and are just biding their time before returning to the United Nations, Lieberman said. From their point of view, they have been dragged against their will into the negotiations in Jordan. It is their intention to carry on with talks in Jordan until January the 26th, and immediately after that date renew their offensive at the United Nations to achieve recognition of a state. An Israeli official quoted Lieberman as saying of the Palestinians' attempt to secure full state membership at the United Nations, which Israel fiercely opposes. Anyone talking about progress in talks with the Palestinians has no idea what he's talking about, Lieberman said. As a reward for Jordan's efforts in making these peace talks possible, U.S. President Barack Obama has invited Jordan's King Abdullah to the United States on January the 17th for a meeting between them. The subject of their talks will include the goal of a negotiated peace between Israel and the Palestinians, according to a spokesperson for the United States. Next, we're going to share with you the latest developments regarding the possibility of a regional war in the Middle East, which could include Israel, Syria, and Iran. The Syrian government of Bashar Assad is on the verge of collapse due to the pressure of economic sanctions that have been imposed upon it by the United States and Europe, as well as the Arab League, along with civil unrest. Canada has ordered its banks to freeze any assets they hold for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird said, "Canada will continue to put the squeeze on the Assad regime. We will not sit idly by, not while Assad continues to violate the rights of the Syrian people." The oil minister of Syria said that his country's oil production was reduced by 30 to 35% of its capacity as a result of the international sanctions. The current Syrian oil production is about 260,000 barrels per day out of a total capacity of 380,000 barrels per day. The European Union has stepped up its sanctions against the Syrian oil industry. European companies are prohibited from acting in Syria, which has led oil companies such as Shell and Total to stop operating in Syria. For its part, the Arab League has imposed sanctions on financial transactions and other dealings with Syria. Because of the international sanctions against Syria and internal civil unrest, Israel Defense Minister Ehud Barak estimates that Bashar Assad only has a few weeks left in power. Even if it is hard to clearly see the exact date when the regime will fall, the trend is clear, and with every day that passes, the regime is getting closer to the end of its rule, and its grip is loosening. Syrian opposition leader Khaled Daer said that the situation in Syria is so bleak that he considers Syrian President Bashar Assad's regime to have already been toppled. The Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv reported that Russia proposed to the Syrian vice president for him to assume the powers of president for a transitional period until Syrian elections can be held. The Israeli newspaper said that the United States has agreed to this proposal. Several months ago, Bashar Assad said that he would start a missile war with Israel rather than being removed from power, and as a result, Israel is preparing itself for a possible war with Syria. Now, let's look at the current situation with Iran. Iran announced that it has produced its first nuclear fuel rod. Nuclear fuel rods contain pellets of enriched uranium that provide fuel for nuclear power plants. On January the 8th, Iran announced its deep underground uranium enrichment site at Fordo near Qom goes stream, soon thereby crossing another red line set by the West in a face-off against Iran's nuclear weapons program. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization said that 20%, 3.5%, and 4% enriched uranium can be produced at this site. According to Israeli intelligence gathering website Debka, Iran is preparing an underground test of a 1 kiloton nuclear device during 2012. Underground facilities are under construction in great secrecy behind the noise and fury raised by the start of advanced uranium enrichment at Iran's fortified subterranean Fordo site near Qom. In an attempt to stop Iran's nuclear program, on December the 31st, U.S. President Barack Obama signed into law measures penalizing foreign financial institutions doing business with Iran's central bank. The U.S. law targets anyone dealing with Iran's central bank to choose between buying oil from Iran or being shut out of transactions with U.S. financial institutions and banks. The new sanctions will begin taking effect in 60 days. However, the toughest measures of these laws will not go into effect for at least 6 months, giving Iran enough time to cooperate with international demands to call off its nuclear weapons program. These are the toughest sanctions imposed yet by the West over Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. The United States is also pressuring China, Japan, and South Korea to trim its Iranian oil imports. Stiffer economic sanctions and an oil embargo against Iran is being rejected by China and Russia. China has so far rebuffed U.S. overtures against Iran by arguing that there should be no link between trade with Iran and its nuclear program. Sanctioning is not the correct approach to easing tensions, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said. Iran and Russia is replacing the U.S. dollar with their national currencies in bilateral trade, Iran's state-run Fars news agency has said. Fars also reported that Iran has replaced the dollar in its oil trade with India, China, and Japan. European Union governments have agreed to a meeting on January the 23rd to decide on an oil embargo against Iran. EU states have already agreed in principle to an embargo on imports of Iranian oil, part of the latest Western efforts to increase pressure on Iran over its nuclear program. However, they still have to finalize details of when it will be imposed. European Union countries buy nearly 600,000 barrels of oil per day of Iran's 2.6 million in exports, making the bloc collectively the largest market for Iranian oil, rivaling China. In recent weeks, Iran has repeatedly warned that it would see the signing of this measure by the United States restricting transactions with its central banks in an oil embargo as an act of war and respond with drastic steps, including the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. On a daily basis, around 1/4 of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. The opening of the Strait of Hormuz is strategic for the world's economy. Iran's Navy has completed a 10-day drill in international waters beyond the strategic Strait of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Navy Chief Admiral warned that his country can easily close the strategic Strait of Hormuz. Iran is holding the war games to show off its prowess in defense capabilities to the West. The United States responded to the Iranian threats by saying that it will continue to deploy its warships in the Gulf. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is based in Bahrain, said it would not allow shipping to be disrupted in the strait. George Little, the U.S. Pentagon press secretary, said Wednesday that any attempt to close the strait will not be tolerated, which angered Iranian officials. U.S., Russian, French, and British air and naval forces streamed to the Syrian and Iranian coasts over the past weekend on guard for fresh developments at the two Middle East flashpoints. In preparation for war, Great Britain is sending its most powerful naval vessel to the Gulf to counter any potential Iranian attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz. The ship, a Type 45 destroyer named HMS Daring, is set to arrive in the Gulf by the end of January. Powder keg doesn't even begin to describe tensions in the Middle East between the United States and Iran, said Louise Arbour, president of the International Crisis Group. Well, this concludes this week's update, where we shared with you regarding the current situation with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and prospects for a regional war in the Middle East involving the United States, Israel, Syria, and Iran. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.